Hi everyone, and welcome to Project Ocean's Wellness Series. This is episode 2 of our podcast. My name is Gina. I am a Project Ocean Peer Educator, and my pronouns are she and her. Today we will be discussing boundaries, and boundaries may or may not be something that you are familiar with. So today we just want to provide some definitions and examples about boundaries. I am joined by one of our CAPS counselors, Dr. Beth Sullivan. And just a little bit about Dr. Sullivan. Dr. Sullivan is a licensed psychologist at the Counseling and Psychological Services within Long Beach State. Her interests focus on psychodynamic and interpersonal-based brief therapies, LGBTQIA concerns, intimate partner violence, couples counseling, healthy relationships, sexual assault and trauma, healthy living, family of origin, and identity development. Okay, so now I want to introduce Dr. Sullivan to all of you. Dr. Sullivan, if you'd like to say hello.
Hey everyone, glad to be here.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sullivan. And as I said, today our topic is boundaries, and we're just going to go into a few questions that will be based around a student's perspective and a professional perspective. So first we want to define boundaries. So Dr. Sullivan, can you maybe give us a definition on what are boundaries?
Sure. I mean, in the simplest way, like to kind of describe boundaries, it's basically the line between what we're willing to accept and what we're not willing to accept in relationships. While that seems like it's pretty concrete, obviously it can become very complex. But yeah, it's basically what we're willing to accept and what we're not willing to accept in relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for students, it really can be something that we don't think about as much. And even when we have like those problems or maybe just like an annoyance with someone, we don't really think of putting up a boundary. So how do you think we can self-define our boundaries and like identify them?
Yeah, I mean, I think like what you're speaking to is nothing, it's kind of for everybody. I mean, it's not just students, it's kind of, you know, I worked with adults in the past too, and it's just boundaries are something that tend to be kind of difficult to enact. Sometimes it feels like we're going to be hurting someone's feelings or somebody might get hurt, but they are super important. And I think the best way to really like kind of define your own boundaries, it starts with like a self-assessment. You know, how well do you know yourself? So I think we can like, you know, first starting to look at like, what do you value? What are you comfortable with? You know, how much energy do you have? Are you an introvert, an extrovert? You know, do you like to eat on a schedule? You know, things like that are different ways we set boundaries. And so just kind of, it really starts with this idea of like self-awareness and understanding kind of like what we're comfortable with. And it's going to vary from person to person, and it's going to vary from relationship to relationship. So I think the other complicated thing about this is it's not just the same boundaries for every single person. So for example, you're going to probably set different boundaries with a professor than you would a friend, than you would a family member. And so, you know, knowing what your comfort is in each one of those situations is really important. I think it's also important to consider like, you know, boundaries can change within a relationship. So, you know, this is kind of common if you think about like a dating relationship, and kind of at the very beginning of the relationship, you spend all this time together and it seems to be fine. You know, obviously as students though, you have to dedicate time to your academics. And so maybe in the beginning of the relationship, you're more flexible around how much time you spend together. But then as the relationship kind of progresses, maybe you start to refocus a little bit more on academics. And so the time spent together is a little bit less. And so they can change within the relationship too. So it's just sort of, it's something you're kind of continually checking in on. It's not something that's always set. That being said, there are some that are very firm, you know, that will probably remain the same boundary for your entire life. You know, things around safety tend to be pretty rigid, things like that. But a lot of times it's flexible. It's flexible from person to person and relationship to relationship. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think that's really really helpful in thinking about the different types of boundaries that you put up. Like you said, like with a professor, with a friend, and with family, the difference between like personal and professional really can be very different, and especially different for each person. So I think that's a really good point to bring up. And just like thinking about what makes you comfortable and what makes you uncomfortable, and being able to voice those things. And so I think for the next question, we just want to know, how do we know if our boundaries are healthy or if they're hurting us, or if they're, especially if like we're always thinking about hurting someone else, how do we know they're healthy, but they're also like where they need to be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if they're not healthy, I think you're just going to be able to kind of feel it. You may have a resentment towards somebody. Potentially there's disappointment in the relationship. You may feel violated depending on what kind of boundary violation there was. Potentially you feel trapped or suffocated. Maybe you feel distant. And so I think you can tell just by how you feel in the relationship. Do you feel valued? Do you feel respected? There's all kinds of different boundaries that we actually, and I probably could have mentioned this too. It's like there's all kinds of different boundaries in a relationship. So somebody may respect one boundary, like a physical boundary, but maybe they don't respect the time boundary, or your emotional boundary. And so there's all different ways in which, boundaries are kind of present in a relationship. And so some may be healthy and some may be not, which is, I think, then it just makes it a little bit more confusing. So ultimately, I think it's just how satisfied are you with the relationship? How content are you? Do you feel respected? Do you feel valued? Does the other person respect your values, your ideas, your thoughts? And, are you comfortable with like the status and things of the relationship? Those are pretty much telltale signs. A lot of times I don't know if you've ever heard of the word enmeshment, but that's like when you're overly no boundaried, right? So enmeshment is like you're like, I don't know, I guess I'm thinking of like overly connected, right? You just kind of the other person becomes like the sole, focus, and you don't have any time for yourself. So you essentially end up losing yourself in the person. And then on the other side of that is when boundaries are overly, when we're too restrictive on our boundaries, sometimes we can feel distant from people. So, I think those are just kind of basic guidelines, but generally we know because we feel it. We just sometimes tend to make an excuse about, why we don't want to enforce the boundary because it feels uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to just think about. Also, thinking about nowadays how many of us are at home, or maybe our living situation is different, our school situation is very different, and just thinking about how we kind of set up our boundaries, yeah. And like you said, if we have to evaluate if they're too weak, like if we are giving too much to other people and not really thinking of ourselves, or if we are not giving, like not connecting with other people and kind of, I don't know, staying too introverted. I don't know. I think that might be more almost like a hermit. Retreating within ourselves. And that's also something that we want to be careful of when we're setting up these boundaries and evaluating our boundaries. And you did say something about like boundaries are, some of them are movable and some of them are firm. So if we are moving around a boundary, that comes more so with the experience with like the relationship, you think?
I think so, yeah. And just kind of knowing yourself. I mean, we are people that are constantly evolving, right? So what we might need one year, we might not need the next year. And so it's really just about our evolving, maybe the other person's evolving. And so sometimes we care more about things than others, So I think it's just more about how we evolve as humans. And this is a process that will take place in any relationship as it gets to be more long-term,
Yeah, and when thinking about relationship, you mean that in the sense like a friendship, like romantic. It doesn't have to be just like one set thing. It's like any.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really every relationship because, we're always, we're evolving. So that means all of the relationships are going to change in some form. Maybe how much time you want to spend with your family changes. Maybe the importance of family changes, right? So it's like, as you get older, you may start to value the family time maybe than you did when you were younger. Things like that. So yeah, it definitely is not just one relationship. It's all of them, because we're just evolving all the time.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to go into our next question. Why do boundaries matter, you think?
Well, I guess they matter mostly because if you want to have healthy relationships, they have to be a part of it. I mean, relationships aren't going to thrive unless there are some boundaries within that relationship. And because you're going to feel all the things when they're not there. You're going to feel trapped or suffocated or distant or resentment. All those things will show up if they're not there. But I think another point that I think is really important is like I think it's a reflection of your self-worth as well. Like we all sort of, get to set up the boundaries and define how we want our relationships to be. That's our right. And I think that when you have healthy boundaries, it really is a way that we express our self-worth. We're telling people we're worthy of what we're asking for. And when we don't set appropriate boundaries, the unconscious or conscious message that we do end up, telling ourselves is that we don't matter. And so I think it really matters in self-worth as well. We can't feel all that good about ourselves if we're not setting up good boundaries. And I think that's, one of the things that probably people don't really take into consideration. It's not just about the physical time, all those things. It's really just about how we feel about ourselves. So it's really important.
Yeah, and speaking of like setting up boundaries, I think as college students, for myself, I am a first generation student, so being away from home was almost like a physical boundary, and now I had to like figure out how to talk to my parents that I can't come home every weekend, I can't see you every weekend, and so just like as like a college student, how do we like communicate these boundaries with our family and friends, especially now in this time of COVID that life has changed for everyone?
Yeah, definitely. You make a good point. Most students probably did have a physical boundary, and now that's totally changed. Setting and communicating boundaries, is no easy task. Some are easier than others. So just acknowledging that, it's okay to have difficult conversations. I really think that people should reflect on the word boundary and what it means to them, because, what is it that people are so afraid of? There's a lot of fears around it, right? So I think that's sort of the backstory of how we sort of communicate. But you really want to analyze, like, how do you feel about boundaries? What makes it so hard? So you can start to kind of break down that barrier a little bit. And then when it comes to actually communicating our barriers, I think it's best to just be clear and direct. It's okay to say that you're tired and, you really need some time. It's okay to say that you're not a hugger. It's okay to say, especially now, right? Especially now in this time, there may be some people more comfortable with hugging and not, and I bring that up. That's true all the time. I mean, some people are comfortable with hugging, but this may be something that becomes more salient now. There's emotional boundaries, which I feel like sometimes maybe are a little bit harder. So just kind of acknowledging, like, I'm willing to have this relationship with you, but only if I can feel respected and only if I can feel valued. And I think it's okay to say that and just be very direct, and I know that feels hard. But again, you're setting your worth and you're telling people, like, I have limits of what I can handle. I think also learning to say no and being comfortable with saying no is going to be very important when we set boundaries. And then lastly is being okay with the outcome. Setting boundaries, we have no control over how the other person is going to respond. So that's out of our control, but we can control what we communicate and what we set. And sometimes people aren't going to respond well, and that's okay. As long as you're living within your values and your things that are mattering to you, I think it's still okay. We're not out trying to hurt anybody's feelings or anything, but that's not what I mean. But it's like sometimes we set boundaries that hurt other people's feelings, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. And I think that's really important to remember. So just kind of being okay with that and sort of managing emotions and practicing self-care after a conversation like this can be helpful.
And I feel like how you said, just figuring out what is okay and what is not okay, and being able to directly say that is probably the best way to go. Don't try to go around it, because either way, it almost feels like one side or you might get hurt. Like you might get hurt or the other side might get hurt. So just try to be as direct as you can be. And especially with family, I think it can be the hardest, almost communicating the boundaries. I know for myself, my family is very always trying to get together, always wanting to have parties, and we really can't. And I always try to tell them we need to not do this and try to be as safe as possible. So that was a new boundary almost to put up, that I can't see every day anymore. I can't see my cousins every week, and that's something that was really different for all of us. And it was hard to communicate at first, like just saying, like, it was almost like I was trying not to say it directly, but when I did, it did help, and like the point got across and the boundary got better, and that was really helpful. And just being at home now is like, my parents don't always understand. I have a lot of homework, I have a lot of exams, and that was something almost new to them, because they weren't calling me all the time when I was at school, so they didn't really know if I was studying or not. And now they see that I really am studying a lot of the time. I'm in a club, or I'm doing something. Like, it's almost like I was a different person before this like physical boundary was taken away. And with that physical boundary being taken away, new boundaries were made, things that I didn't even think of before. And I think it is just thinking about giving yourself permission, almost like you said, learning how to say no, learning when to ask for your time back is very important. And with friends, family, like you said, any relationship, you just need to be able to communicate that. And I feel like if you can communicate it and they can understand you, that can almost make the relationship closer or healthier.
100%, yeah. I mean, I think when you work through some of the boundaries, people really appreciate it, because all of us want to know, what people actually need. If nobody tells us, then we don't know if we're actually doing the right things in a relationship. So boundaries actually give everybody guidance as well. It's not sometimes they hurt, sometimes they're hard to say, but at the end of the day, you know where that person stands. And so it just actually makes the relationship easier. Like, okay, like I know what I can do and what I can't, I know what you like, what you don't like. I understand this. And that definitely opens doors to be a deeper connection for sure. And thank you for sharing that experience about just kind of with your family. That's such a common, thing that I hear as well. And it's really difficult, the idea of people being students. People don't really understand what that means. It's like, no, we actually do study and we do have homework. And so, just being able to fight for that and set up your own boundaries is awesome. So good for you.
Thank you. Yeah, it is something that was new to me. Just boundaries in general. It's not something that I feel like in my household we talked about, or with the people around me we ever really talked about. So it is something that has been more on my radar, and I've been trying to just figure out my boundaries and how to set them up with each person and each relationship. And COVID really has changed that. So I think we have touched on it a little bit, and I just want to ask, how have boundaries changed since COVID? We have touched on it a little bit.
Yeah.
You want to go a little more into it?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add to kind of what you said is, obviously people are living in different places and we have a little bit of different roles, but I think just acknowledging the fact that some boundaries may become more important all of a sudden. Maybe health and safety, people really didn't even think about, young students, most students don't really think too much about their health unless it's something, but something like this that kind of boundary may become more important, and that's fine. And that's what that kind of fluidity with boundaries is. So I'm imagining that probably people are noticing boundaries that they need to set that they maybe never have had to before. And that totally makes sense in a situation like this. So, just the sense that actual boundaries may change and what becomes more important.
Yeah, I think, that was like almost an eye-opener for me, and probably for a lot of other people. This new, like, era that we're in, that no one really knows what's going to happen, you start to realize things that maybe you were a little more okay with before, and now you need to set up that boundary. So I think it is important as college students or just as people, just thinking about our boundaries. And like you said, they are ever changing. It is something we will be thinking about our whole lives. So just to let them change and like figure out like who you are, and just like think about your boundaries and how to set them with different people.
Yep. And also, just practice makes perfect, I think if this is something people are starting to do, it's going to feel uncomfortable, but that's totally fine. The more you're able to sort of do it, the better it gets along the way. And I think it just gets a little bit easier. So, this is probably the first time some people are even going to be thinking about it. So expect to feel a little bit uncomfortable, feel like it's taking a risk, but know that it's worth it and that you'll have healthier relationships in the end.
Yeah, I really love how you said practice makes perfect. I think, that's something that I'm realizing, that I just need to practice saying these things and practicing thinking about like self-reflection, thinking about my boundaries and how to set them up. So those are all our questions for today, and I hope that this can help some of our students. Thank you so much for taking this time, Dr. Sullivan, to address these questions and just get boundaries on our radar to get us thinking, self-reflecting.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I love talking about this stuff. I know it's not easy. Thank you for being so open and just being willing to kind of do this podcast. And I hope this resonates with students and that it can be helpful and powerful. So thank you. It's been great.
So now I just want to take this time to summarize and talk about what we discussed. We just want to think about boundaries, what are boundaries, what are our personal boundaries, and how to set them. So when we're thinking about this, we want to think about self-reflection, thinking about what makes us uncomfortable, what makes us comfortable, and what is okay and what is not okay. And that can be with any relationship, be that romantic or personal, professional. We want to identify our boundaries. And just identifying new boundaries that may not be normal. COVID has changed the lives of all of us. And for students, this may be going back home. That physical boundary isn't there anymore. So you may feel a loss of independence. And just bringing up these boundaries to your friends and your family, being as direct as you can, that can really help. And just thinking about COVID, it might be a health concern for many people, and these boundaries may come in a way that might hurt someone, but we do want to be as direct as we can and think about our personal health when we're thinking about our boundaries and our relationships. So to close off, I would like to remind our listeners that Counseling and Psychological Services, also known as CAPS, offers programs such as Beachbuddy to provide peer mentoring, and our counselors also have drop-in support groups for individuals and for groups. You can check out CAPS, Project Ocean, and Beachbuddies on our social media accounts to stay updated with more information on our services, events, and other information about mental health and wellness. My name is Gina Segura, and I am from Project Ocean, and I would like to thank you for listening in on our topic of boundaries. I hope you stay safe, stay healthy, think about your boundaries, and have a good weekend. Thank you.